For 6 months, 14 people clung to survival on a frozen island in the Arctic Ocean, eating seal meat raw when fuel ran out, sleeping in snow shelters when their ship became a tomb of ice, and watching 11 of their companions die one by one in the white emptiness. They were 200 miles from the nearest human settlement, surrounded by pack ice that shifted like broken glass, without any certainty that rescue would ever come. This is the true story of the Karluk expedition, a scientific journey that became a study in how the Arctic tests not just the body, but the will to remain human when everything civilized has been stripped away. In the summer of 1913, a 3-masted brigantine named the Karluk sailed north from British Columbia carrying 25 souls. They were scientists, crew members, and support staff for the Canadian Arctic expedition, an ambitious plan to map the last blank spaces on the globe. The ship's captain was Robert Bartlett, a Newfoundlander who had navigated ice-choked waters for 2 decades. Bartlett knew the Arctic the way some men know cities, its moods, its betrayals, its rare moments of mercy. The expedition leader was Vilhjalmur Stefansson, a charismatic explorer who believed the Arctic was a friendly place if you understood its rhythms. Stefansson had lived with Inuit communities. He had crossed frozen wastelands by adopting their methods. He spoke with the confidence of someone who had survived before and would survive again. But the Arctic doesn't care about your previous experience. It doesn't care about credentials or planning. And in September 1913, it demonstrated this with mechanical precision. The Karluk pushed north through the Beaufort Sea, its wooden hull groaning against ice floes that crowded tighter each day. By mid-September, the ship was no longer sailing. It was drifting, locked in pack ice that gripped it like a fist. The ice moved according to currents and wind, carrying the Karluk west, away from the planned route, away from mapped territory. Stefansson made a decision. He would leave the ship with a small party, travel over the ice to hunt for food, and scout the route ahead. He took 5 men and left Bartlett in command. Before departing, Stefansson told the captain he would return in 10 days. He never came back. On January 10th, 1914, the ice that had held the Karluk for months suddenly shifted. The pressure was immense, thousands of tons of frozen ocean grinding against itself. The ship's timbers screamed, seams split open, water poured into the hold. Captain Bartlett ordered everything movable onto the ice: supplies, equipment, sleds, dogs. The crew worked in darkness lit by lanterns, hauling crates across unstable ice while the ship groaned behind them. Then, at 3 p.m. on January 11th, the Karluk's back broke. The stern rose into the air, the mast tilted, and the ship that had carried them into the Arctic slid beneath the ice with the sound of wood surrendering to physics. They stood on the frozen ocean with what they had managed to save. They were 200 miles north of the Siberian coast, adrift on ice that moved unpredictably. The temperature was 45 degrees below zero, and they were now walking. Bartlett understood their situation with cold clarity. The ice was unstable. It could open beneath them at any moment. Their only chance was to reach land. The nearest solid ground was Wrangel Island, a desolate rock 80 miles to the southwest. It had been sighted by explorers but rarely visited. No one lived there, but it was land, and land meant a stable platform to wait for rescue. The march began. 25 people, dozens of sled dogs, and tons of supplies moving across pressure ridges, jagged walls of ice pushed up by colliding floes. Some ridges were 20 feet high. The sleds had to be unloaded, hauled over, and reloaded on the other side. Then the process repeated. Progress was measured in hundreds of yards per day. The cold worked at exposed skin like sandpaper. Frostbite blackened fingers and toes. Men wrapped their faces in layers of wool and fur, but the wind found gaps. You couldn't stop moving. If you stopped, your sweat froze against your skin. If you rested too long, you didn't get up. After 10 days of walking, they reached Wrangel Island, not the main island, a small outcropping of rock and snow at its southern edge. They had made it. Bartlett organized the survivors into camps, counted their supplies, and performed a brutal calculation. They had enough food for 50 days if rationed carefully. After that, they would need to hunt. The island had seals. It might have polar bears. There were birds in summer, but it was January, the heart of Arctic winter when the sun never rose. Bartlett made another calculation. If they waited on Wrangel for rescue, they might wait forever. Stephenson was gone. No one knew where the Karluk had sunk. The only way to ensure rescue was for someone to walk to the Siberian coast and reach civilization. Captain Bartlett would make that walk himself. On February 5th, 1914, Bartlett departed Wrangel Island with one Inuit hunter named Kataktovik, intending to cross 80 miles of pack ice to reach Siberia and then walk 700 miles along the coast to the nearest settlement with telegraph capability. It was an almost incomprehensible journey, where a single misstep could mean drowning in freezing water, losing the coast entirely, or digging into snow during storms just to survive the night. Bartlett left the remaining survivors under the command of First Officer Alexander Sandy Anderson, reducing the group on Wrangel Island to 23 people tasked with rationing food, hunting when possible, and enduring until help arrived. Anderson divided them into two groups, keeping the main camp at the southern cache, while 4 men insisted on attempting their own march toward Siberia, despite warnings that the breaking ice made such a journey nearly suicidal. The 4 men left anyway, Bredy, Malek, Maman, and McKinley, driven by a mixture of desperation and belief that movement offered better odds than waiting. None of them would ever be seen alive again, their disappearance becoming a silent lesson in how the Arctic punishes optimism without preparation. The survivors who remained faced the mathematics of survival with limited flour, tea, pemmican, and canned goods that shrank with every passing day while the calendar worked against them. They turned to hunting seals, understanding that, without fresh meat, the slow collapse of their bodies would begin long before starvation became visible. Seals surfaced through breathing holes in the ice, small dark circles that demanded patience measured in hours of stillness beside freezing openings. When a seal appeared, there was only one chance to strike, because a missed attempt meant the animal vanished into black water, and the hunters returned to camp with nothing but wasted energy. The survivors adapted quickly, learning to approach from downwind, to drag carcasses away from holes before they slipped back into the ocean, and to use every part of the animal for food, fuel, and repairs. They often ate the meat raw when fuel was scarce, discovering through necessity what Inuit hunters had long known, that uncooked seal meat preserved vital nutrients that prevented scurvy. But hunting created a cruel equation, because every expedition across the ice consumed calories that had to be replaced by successful kills, or the body would begin its quiet decline. It was a closed system where survival depended on balancing effort and reward, and one bad stretch of hunting could push a man from strength to weakness without warning. As February became March, the returning sun brought light, but also psychological pressure, revealing cracks in the ice that formed widening leads of open water around the island. The survivors realized they were trapped not by frozen seas, but by the absence of stable ice, a shifting boundary that made rescue uncertain from every direction. Anderson kept the men occupied with constant tasks, reinforcing shelters, hauling ice for water, and maintaining equipment, because inactivity invited despair more effectively than hunger ever could. Privately, he recorded observations in a journal, noting subtle changes in behavior that signaled decline, such as men who stopped grooming themselves or began withdrawing from conversation. In March, 2 men died, one from illness and another from what was described as general weakness, a phrase that masked the slow erosion of body and spirit. They were buried in shallow graves, carved into frozen ground, with tools that struggled against permafrost, reminders that death had become part of daily routine. April arrived with violent winds that transformed Wrangel Island into a landscape of moving snow and disorientation, where storms erased all sense of direction within minutes. During these whiteouts, the survivors stayed inside canvas shelters reinforced with snow blocks, knowing that stepping outside without visibility could lead to freezing within sight of safety. Food shortages forced a decision no one wanted to make, and the survivors began eating the sled dogs that had once symbolized mobility and companionship. Each animal was used completely, meat for survival, bones for broth, pelts for insulation, because in the Arctic, nothing could be wasted without consequences. By May, 11 people had died from scurvy, exposure, infection, or the quiet surrender that came when one man walked into a storm and never returned alive. 14 remained, bound together not just by necessity, but by the fragile routines Anderson maintained to keep them focused on survival rather than loss. Every morning, Anderson gathered the group, assigning tasks and reinforcing the belief that rescue was close. Even as his private writings revealed, he understood the odds were shrinking. Hope became another rationed resource, distributed carefully through routine and leadership, because without it, the remaining survivors might simply stop trying. In June, the ice around Wrangel Island fractured violently, massive floes cracking with sounds like distant artillery, while open ocean expanded between drifting slabs of frozen water. The survivors listened to the booming ice at night, understanding that if rescue did not arrive by ship during this window, the opportunity might vanish completely. On July 7, 1914, a dark shape appeared on the horizon, at first dismissed as an Arctic mirage caused by bending light and exhausted minds searching for salvation. But the shape grew larger and began to move, revealing itself not as illusion, but as a ship cutting through broken ice toward the island where 14 survivors still waited. The vessel was the King and Winge, a small schooner Captain Bartlett had chartered after his 700-mile walk to the Siberian coast. Bartlett had reached civilization in April, sent telegrams, and organized a rescue that took 3 months to bring a ship capable of navigating ice-choked waters back north. But he had kept his promise. When Bartlett stepped onto Wrangel Island, he found 14 survivors, gaunt, bearded, dressed in patched furs after 6 months of isolation. 11 of their companions were buried in the permafrost. The 4 men who had tried to walk to Siberia were never found, their absence lingering like a warning written into the landscape itself. The survivors carried journals, scientific observations, and artifacts salvaged from the Karluk, fragments of order preserved against chaos. These objects now sit in museums as quiet testimony to a voyage that failed its mission, but documented its struggle with meticulous care. The expedition's scientific goals were never achieved, yet the journals remain, filled with precise handwriting that recorded temperatures, ice conditions, and the names of men who died on a frozen island waiting for rescue that almost never came. The story of Wrangel Island endures not because it offers comfort, but because it refuses to soften the reality of what happened. It raises uneasy questions about leadership and abandonment, about who chooses to stay and who chooses to walk into the ice with uncertain odds. It is a story about the distance between planning and reality, between the confidence of explorers and the humility forced upon them by an Arctic that does not negotiate. What the survivors demonstrated was not heroism in the traditional sense, but something far less romantic and far more difficult to sustain. They refused to lie down and disappear, even when hunger, cold, and grief stripped away everything familiar. They ate seal meat raw, buried their friends in frozen ground, and endured storms that erased tracks and threatened to erase memory itself. When rescue finally came, they climbed aboard without ceremony and sailed south, carrying a quieter understanding of survival. Survival was not a victory speech or a grand narrative, but a decision repeated each morning in the cold when giving up would have been easier. If stories like this reshape how you think about endurance and leadership, consider supporting this channel so more true survival accounts can be shared. Like the video, subscribe, and join us for more stories of survival, sacrifice, and the places that test what it means to remain human.